Hello, everyone. Just wait a few moments for letting everyone joining this webinar. So for the sake of time, I'll try to start and breaking the ice with this webinar. Meanwhile, people will join us. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our fifth event of CLIMAAX Community of Practice. I'm Fulvio Bidao from the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, and today I'll be moderating the event with my colleague Gloria Mozzi here with me. This webinar is dedicated, as you know, to effective communication of risk in climate adaptation. And as usual, before we start, a few housekeeping rules. Please note that this meeting is in the form of a webinar, so is being recorded and you don't have the chance to open your mic or the camera. But anyway, we encourage you to post your questions and comments throughout the webinar using the Q&A box that you can find at the bottom of the Zoom screen. The recording will be available later on, so if you miss something, you'll be able to catch up later. This is our agenda for today. We'll begin with deep up presentation and introduction by Hilda Mannino from Venice International University. Hilda will set the scene, introducing key principles and resources for science communication, particularly drawing from our experience in the COLIS and the Quest project dedicated to science communication. And actually, the COLIS project is developing a EU Competence Center on Science Communication and its academy. And next, we'll hear from two practitioners that will share their insights, experiences, and best practices for climate risk communication. Julia Crammy from the British Geological Survey, introducing us to the storylines approach that is used in the Myriad project for unpacking the complexity of multi-risk events. And then we will have Simone Nardichia from the Municipality of Milan, introducing us to the climate stories and heatwave risk maps that are used to communicate heatwaves risk, drawing from the experience in the Reach Out project. After this presentation, we'll move into a more interactive panel discussion to dive deeper into these experiences and practices. And a quick reminder to all of you that you can use the Q&A box, and we will try to address the question during the discussion. So just to remind you that this community of practice represents a space for knowledge exchange, mutual learning, and peer support between practitioners that are working or interested in climate risk assessment and adaptation. And these events we are hosting are specifically designed to address different aspects of this climate risk assessment, including technical and social facets. And this should be tailored to the needs and interests of the community. So those interests that you've expressed. These events directly try to respond to your input by trying to highlight key resources, best practices, and guidance to inspire and support your work in climate risk assessment and adaptation. And so far, we have covered the practical application of the climate toolbox, how to engage citizens and stakeholders in climate risk assessment and management. And today we are addressing how to communicate climate risk, translating complex risk data into actionable knowledge to raise awareness, but also to inform decision making. So without further ado, I will start with our first speaker, Hilda Mannino, who is scientific coordinator of the intensive graduate activities and the TEM program of sustainability at the Venice International University. She has a PhD in environmental science and was postdoc fellow at the Center of Industrial Ecology at Yale University. So she has a long experience in research and training activities on themes like science communication, environmental policy, And among these, she is currently involved, I said, in the Horizon Europe Coalition project to develop EU competence centers on science communication in its dedicated academy. And she was also scientific coordinator of another project, Horizon 2020, on quality science communication, basically working on the development of a toolkit on quality science communication for scientists and recommendation for policymakers. So I will directly give the floor to you, Hilda, for giving your talk. And thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks to all the speakers present here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Fulvio. So I'm going to share my my screen now. Can you see it?
Yeah, perfectly.
Great. So thank you for the introduction, Fulvio, and thank you to the CLIMAAX project for having invited me as representative of CoP to contribute to this webinar on effective communication of risk in climate adaptation. As already mentioned, I'm part of the Venice International University and the CoP project. Just to spend a few words on this project, it's a EU-funded project that has the ambition to develop the European Competence Center for Science Communication. This Competence Center will be formed by a virtual platform that is already online. I will share the link later. And a network of physical hubs spread all around Europe. And what it will offer will be resources to support science communication that comes from previous projects and previous initiatives, and that are for all of the actors in science communication, so from scientists to policymakers and practitioners. And we will also offer a training, and this is the reason why I'm here today. So as anticipated, today I will share some tips that we developed in one of the projects on science communication on which CoP is based, the QUEST project. So we'll start from the definition of science communication, so as common basis, and then I will share these tips. So starting from what science communication is, actually there is not a broadly recognized definition. One that I quite like is the one by Horst and Davis that underline how we have very different formats of science communication. So you can go from public speaking, public talks, and popular writing, but also theater performance and so on. So what makes them science communication is that they are intended action. So they want to communicate science, but not only the final findings. So in some cases, it's really relevant to communicate about methodology, processes or practices in science communication. And the real core of science communication is that the audience is an audience of non-scientists, or even better, of non-experts on the topic that you are communicating about. And this is the real challenge because we are most used to communicate to our peers. When it comes to communicate to other publics, it can be a real challenge. And we actually asked two researchers what are the challenges that they face when they have to communicate about their research in the QUEST project. And we came out with this list. So first of all, there is a lack of time because it's actually a time-demanding activity. And quite often it's not so recognized in your time load. So it's an extra time. And a lot of researchers, for instance, feel also they lack capacities and training. And so this is a good reason why probably many of you are here today. And then there are challenges that are really related in how to communicate. So how to deliver the message, what language to use, but also the relation with the public. Because we are talking about a public communication. You are not talking about with your peers. And then there are some challenges that are really topic specific. So when we discussed with the researchers on climate change, what came out were that, for instance, the topic of uncertainty is particularly key, but also challenging to communicate about. And also the risk, because the perception of risk by the publics, by the common citizens, can be quite different by the real risk. And then there are also challenges that are related to the media of communication used. So for instance, if you interact with journalists, there are tensions between researchers and journalists related to the fact that the researchers feel they can be misunderstood or also misinterpreted or disinterpreted. And on the other side, the journalists complain about the fact that scientists are too slow to provide them with good information. Other challenges if we come to social media use, because social media use requires certain literacy on the social media that most of us miss. So what we did in the Quest project was to try to tackle the two key aspects related to how to communicate. So the message delivery and the relation with the public. And what we did was to develop a checklist, an easy one, with the idea that it should be a kind of guidance whenever you have to communicate about your research or your activities. So the idea is really that when you have to communicate, you can refer to this checklist and find what are the attention aspects that you have to focus on and not forget about. So starting from the beginning, this is something on which you don't have always a control, but we wanted to raise awareness on the fact, again, that science communication requires time to be prepared. And especially when you are a not so experienced communicator. So you have to know that if you need to prepare for science communication, you will need time if you want to do it in a good way. But entering the core of science communication again, the audience is the key part. So you are communicating to non-experts on the topic, and you have to keep in mind that they are the purpose of your communication. So your objective is to be understood by the audience. There can be two situations. So in some cases, the audience is given. So for instance, you have been invited to give a talk, or you are interviewed by some journalist, or you are participating in a science festival and so on. So in those cases, to know about your audience, you can ask to the organizers or take information by yourself, just to know who is the audience that you will have to communicate to. The other situation is when you can decide the audience, in the sense that you are organizing by yourself the activity. And so in that case, first of all, you have to choose what is the audience that fit with the purpose of your communication. So what you want to get, raise awareness, open a dialogue, and so on. And then you have also to think about how to engage them. So how to be sure that they will come or they will read and so on, what you want to communicate. And once you have identified the audience, the really key aspect is to start from the so what of your audience. The so what of your audience is what can be of interest for the audience, but also relevant. Maybe they don't know how relevant what you research about can be for them. And you have to start from that. So your communication activity should be sure to meet these interest and relevance aspects. And having this in mind, you have then define and fix what are the key messages that you want to deliver. Remember, since you are talking to non-experts on the topic, you cannot expect they can digest too many messages of something that they are not expert in. So the suggestion here is to decide few key messages, 1, 2, very maximum 3, and focus on them, your communication. So what I always suggest is write them down, just to have them under your eyes when you prepare for the communication. And then we came in another key aspect of science communication, that is framing the message and framing the communication activity. Framing in communication means choose what you want to say, but also how you are going to say it. And you can really, the frames are defined as the storylines that make your issue relevant or of interest for a specific audience. So that's your goal here. So you can use story, you can use metaphors, again, focusing on the concerns, interest, and on raising curiosity of the public. So here again, we go back to the idea that you have to have clear in mind what is the so what of your audience. An example related to climate change on different approach to framing an issue is, for instance, the urgency to act to mitigate climate change. So you can say the same message, you can deliver the same message using two different approaches. So on the one side, you can have a positive frame. So you can say that if we reduce our emissions of CO2 today, we are going to prevent future flooding. Or a negative frame. If we don't reduce our emissions of CO2 today, we are going to increase the frequency of flooding in the next decades or extreme events. Science and studies say that actually, when you have to deal with a crisis, the positive frame is more effective. If you want to call to action, a positive frame will give the impression to the audience they can do something. While a negative frame, especially if it's repeated over time, as it was, for instance, in the narrative about climate change, can have a counter effect. So can freeze people. People can think they cannot do anything. It's different, of course, when you have to do with a real emergency, like in the case of COVID. So in that case, people have to act immediately. You have a message that will be delivered for a short time. And so in that case, a negative frame could be more effective. Other aspects to frame well your message is to link to today's news, anniversaries, upcoming events. So whatever can be familiar to your audience. So staying on the previous example, if you think about, and for the Italians, in this period, we are experiencing a lot of floods, especially in the center of Italy. And linking to that can make, can raise the curiosity, but also the interest of your public. And another thing that can help when you communicate is show your passion. So if you are a scientist, but also if you are a policy practitioner, I'm sure, and I hope you have a lot of passion about what you do. And showing it also create an empathy with your public that helps in the communication. And then we come to another key element of science communication, that is storytelling. Storytelling is another of the elements that is really considered, and probably some of the next speakers will mention this idea of the storylines. So, and this is related to our species, our evolution. So we were used since the prehistory to listen to story as a way to learn. And even more, we are particularly interested in stories about people. So the idea is that even when you have facts and numbers that people usually like, it's important to embed them in a story, because that helps, again, to make it more familiar and understandable for your public. And here we come to a very key challenge for scientists in particular. So the fact that we need to use a simple explanation to be understood by a public of non-experts. The tips in this case, since this is a real challenge, is first of all, sacrificing some contents. So that helps. So again, if you stick to some key messages, that helps a lot. And try to avoid jargon. Considering that we are biased by the jargon, so the technical language. So we give for granted that people can understand it, but there are some terms that we are used to use that are not so common for a general public. In many cases, visual representation can help. But also in this case, you have to be sure that it's really understandable. So to check if it's really understandable, I will jump to the tip 13. That is, practice your communication with non-experts. So rehearse, first of all, if it's a public talk, but even if it's something written, you have to try to ask to some non-experts to read or to listen to you to be sure that you are clear in your presentation. As I always say, this can be a test for your partners or your family else to see how much they love you to spend time on this. But that's really important to make a double check that you can be understood. Another way to facilitate the understanding is use short sentences. This is a special tips for Italians in particular, because we are used to use very long sentences, especially when we write, but this requires a lot of time to brain work to decodify them. So try to, less is more, is always a mantra for science communication. And now we come to the interaction with the public. So science communication today is more oriented to really open a dialogue with the public. So support interaction. But this has to be planned, and you have to give the audience the opportunity to interact. So for instance, keeping the tone conversational is a way to support interaction. Or thinking about activities to engage the public. Both when you write, for instance, asking for feedback, and of course, it's easier if you are talking, so you can open the dialogue with the public. And here again, another aspect is to keep it lively. So offering stories, anecdotes, images, again, is also a way not only to frame, but to keep the audience on the topic. But consider that interacting with the public is not always a pleasure. You can encounter opposers. Actually, they are usually a quite small percentage of your audience, but they are quite rumorous. And you have to be prepared for that. First of all, you have to think about what are the controversial aspects of your research or your topic, your activities, and be prepared to discuss about them, but also be prepared to think about some ways out. So for instance, some colleagues usually ask, what could I say to convince you that this is something good, something real? Or going down from the ivory tower of researchers, asking, please, could you share some of the material on which you base your position? Or, and that's not my favorite, but it's the last option. Maybe if it's a public talk, you can just say, okay, we can talk over it during the coffee break and so on. So just keeping in mind that you don't want to arrive to a fight, because otherwise you are going to lose also all of the rest of your audience. So last but not least, in most of the institutions, research institutions, but also policy institutions, we have today some experts in communication. We have communication officers, we have press officers, and you can refer to them for support, or if you don't feel really like a communicator, you can also use them as intermediate to deliver your messages. So again, this was just a very short and fast introduction to the topic of science communication, just to leave you with my two key messages for today. Again, the audience comes first when you communicate, and you need a lot of awareness to communicate in a good way of your audience, what you want from the communication, what messages you want to deliver, and so on. And to conclude, just again, a little spot of the CoLES project. The Competence Center platform is already online, and you will be able in a few weeks to register also as users of the platform. So what I suggest you is to register for our newsletter, and then you will be kept updated on all of our activities. And I stop here. Thank you. And of course, if you have questions, you can start writing in the chat, and then in the panel, I will be able to answer.
Yes, thank you, Hilda, so much for your presentation and also for staying in time. I think many people in our audience found your tips and guides really useful. And I personally did also, because as researchers as well, it's always hard to communicate with the audience that come from a different background than ourselves. So thank you so much for this. And yes, I repeat that if you have questions or curiosity for Hilda, you can put them in the Q&A box and we will try to address them. Thank you, Hilda. We will see you also in a few minutes for the panel discussion. And now I will introduce the next speakers of the day, the practitioners who are going to talk about storyline approach and climate stories for their projects. So first, we have Julia Crummy. She's a volcanologist specializing in explosive volcanic eruptions and associated hazards. Her research focuses on multi-hazard impacts from local to global scales and quantitative hazard analysis. However, more recently, she has explored more qualitative methods to understand the risk drivers. Julia is currently leading a task in the Myriad EU project that is developing multi-risk storylines. These storylines and narratives are co-developed with the stakeholders for disaster risk management and communication of complex science to support planning and decision-making for multi-hazard and multi-risk events. So she's gonna talk to us about the storyline approach in the Myriad EU projects. But first, I also introduce Simone, who will come, whose presentation will come right after. Simone Nardicchia is a project manager at the Urban Resilience Department of the Municipality of Milan. He is actively involved in the implementation of the Horizon 2020 Reach Out project. And his work currently focuses on collecting and analyzing climate data to support the air and climate plan and risk assessment strategies. He's an expert on managing complex projects and developing urban adaptation solutions. He's playing a key role in integrating innovative approaches to enhance Milan's resilience to future climate challenges. So thanks so much for joining us today. And Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. Oh, that should be it. I'm on two screens, so it's going to look like I'm looking the wrong direction, but hopefully it'll all work out. So yeah, thank you. I'm going to just talk a little bit about what we do in Myriad using the storyline approach to deal with multi-risk and the complexities of multi-risk. So where we have multi-risk events, we have interconnected hazards. We have interconnected economic sectors, so where a hazard event might impact one sector and there will be sort of dependencies between sectors where there can be cascading impacts onto other sectors. And what we want to do is really bring them together into multi-risk assessments to really understand those interconnected components of a system. So the different hazards and relationships between hazards, hazard events, and then sorry about that. And then the different sectors that are involved, and to just really understand all these different components of a system and their exposure and vulnerabilities. As a volcanologist, I had to stick something in here, but it's a really good example of showing what really multi-hazard events are. So natural hazard events are rarely single hazard. Often you have interacting hazards that occur simultaneously or cascadingly or cumulatively over time. And these can change, and you can have a lot of different relationships and interactions happening. But just to take the kind of volcano example, when you have magma building up in the subsurface underneath a volcano, that causes seismicity as the magma pushes its way through fractures. That can cause ground shaking, which can cause damage to buildings and infrastructure. It can also cause rock falls and landslides. It can also open up fractures in the ground, which again can damage infrastructure and buildings and things. When you have an explosive eruption, you have a big ash cloud that has impacts on aviation with ash in the atmosphere. You can get fallout from that ash cloud, which then can cause damage and impacts on the ground, on buildings, on infrastructure, on farming, agriculture. If you have a column collapse, you can have a PDC, a pyroclastic density current, which is this kind of really hot, billowing cloud coming down the volcano, the flanks of the volcano, and that has, really serious impacts up to sort of 5-10 kilometers from a volcano. So you get a bit more the distal impacts in there. And then all this debris that's lying on the flanks of the volcano, if you have rains, and this can happen for years after an eruption, you can have volcanic debris, rain can come and just wash it down into mud flows or lahars, which can really travel long distances and impact communities, sort of many kilometers from a volcano. So the kind of range of impacts you can get are really huge. And on the different sectors. And so when we think about these different hazards, so in this example, we've got heat wave, we've got drought, we've got wildfires, winds that can fuel the wildfires, and then you can have, biological hazards, diseases, that kind of thing. This can impact forestry, it can impact agriculture and food, and it can impact the economic sector. So how do we communicate all this and help decision makers to plan for all these kind of different events that are happening? And that's really the key of what Myriad is trying to do. It's trying to kind of look at systemic risk and interdependencies between these sectors. So we have 5 sort of case study regions. We call them our pilot regions. That example about heat wave and drought, that was from the Scandinavia region, but each one is focusing on a different set of hazards and a different set of economic sectors. And the Canary Islands is quite an interesting one, really bringing in tourism into that as well, which kind of brings another aspect. So they have quite different sort of characteristics. And because multi-risk events are so complex, trying to plan for them for the future, we really need to kind of have a deep understanding of past event impacts to prepare for plausible future events. What could a plausible future event look like? And then you can start to derive targeted and effective risk reduction strategies. But often in these situations, they're too complex to really model quantitatively, or there's insufficient data or even the modeling capacity. So we need to bring in different approaches and bring in more qualitative and semi-qualitative tools. And this is just a list of some of the approaches that can be used for, drawing on the disaster risk community, where forensic analysis is commonly used to really explore and understand the root causes and drivers that contribute to disasters. Impact chains are commonly used to kind of visualize and document interconnections between hazards, vulnerability, and exposure. Scenario planning, where you look into the future. A lot of these are often quite quantitative. They use a lot of derivation of probabilities or likelihoods to talk about what the scenarios are. And downward counterfactuals are used a lot to think about a past event and then try to think of what a worse outcome could be from that event. And then this is where storylines come into it. So storylines can bring together a lot of these different approaches. And what they do is use narratives of past or plausible future events to explore and characterize the cause and effect relationships between risk drivers and impacts within a system. And they're really flexible. You can use forensic analysis and impact chains and all these different techniques and methods to pull it together and to really explore those indirect impacts and those kind of sector dependencies. So they kind of help break down the complexity, and that's how we're using them in Myriad. It's to support that understanding of complexity of multi-hazard, multi-risk events, and to facilitate cross-sectoral engagement with stakeholders. So we're bringing groups of stakeholders together and really kind of getting them to supporting them in their understanding of the complex relationships of the different impacts that multi-hazard events can have on them. And the idea is to use these to help draft forward-looking decision-making pathways for disaster risk managers, to think about plausible future events. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the North Sea pilot because that's where I've probably done most of my work in Myriad on. So the North Sea, it has a real issue of space, and space is scarce. It's quite a small area. So you have shipping lanes coming up here. There's a real kind of transition. There's an energy transition into more renewable energy. So in the North Sea, there's a lot of wind farms being built or being planned. Associated with wind farms, you have the infrastructure, you have vessels for maintenance of wind farms. You also have just shipping that's transporting goods, and throughout the North Sea, there's a lot of fisheries. There's sand extraction for the aggregate industry. There's a lot of different sectors and different stakeholders all kind of requiring space in the North Sea. So as spatial density is increasing, we have climate change, we have impacts from climate change. So we have, increasing consecutive storms coming into the North Sea, where we have these really high gusts and extreme kind of precipitation. And it's thought that with this increasing spatial density and climate change, the impacts from multi-hazard events are going to worsen over time. Generally, the kind of planning has been done in a very kind of sector specific way, and there's not really been a multi-sectoral way of pulling all these groups of stakeholders together to try to plan for the North Sea. And this is where Myriad has come in to get those conversations started and get that going. And this is where we've used storylines to do this, to raise awareness, to have the conversations between different stakeholder groups, and to try and sort of facilitate that cross-sector planning. So what we did is, we've created a storyline for the North Sea flooding, the 1953 North Sea flooding event, and we used that to have some conversations about what multi-hazard, multi-risk events can look like. And then in a workshop, we then came up with a storyline thinking about future climate events. I'm going to try opening this, and I really hope this works. It should work. Oops. Here we go. Apologies, it's just taking a minute. So what we've done is we've used story maps to visualize the storylines, and they're so great because you can embed lots of different formats into them as that communication tool. And so within this story map with the stakeholders, we walked through it and we talked about, what was the conditions before the 1953 flood event, what was the timeline of the event, when did the hazard events happen? It was a northwesterly storm developed. It coincided with this deep pressure system and these gale force winds, annual spring tides, and resulted in this storm surge. And then the timeline goes down through what the different impacts were and then the different responses. We also, you can embed YouTube videos into this, which is really handy, and then images to really show and demonstrate what the impacts were. And then we talk about the different responses. So what were the initial short-term responses, and then the more longer-term responses as well. Things like, building of the Thames flood barrier. That was a result of the 1953 floods, where they didn't want this to happen again. So how could they protect it? The Delta works in the Netherlands, again, that became out of the 1953 flood event. And then what we tried to do with the storyline is, because all this is interesting, but so what? Great, that was an event in 1953. What does it matter? So what we tried to do is use the storyline to say, well, okay, that's what happened in the past. What if it happened now? And this is the North Sea now, with wind farms, offshore wind farms. In the next sort of 5 to 10 years, these are all the wind farms that are planned. In 1953, there weren't any wind farms. And so if you think about, if you had this huge storm event, what would the impacts be there on the offshore renewable sector? But also, if we think about the shipping, 1953, there were shipping lanes, but now the spatial density of shipping in the North Sea is huge. And so if you combine that with all these wind farms, you've got a huge amount of vessels, you've got a huge amount of offshore infrastructure. If you've got a storm surge coming down, gale force winds, what could the potential impacts of that be, and how can we think about planning for that? And it's really just to get the conversation started. We don't come up with any answers in this. It's to really start the conversations. Things like, we've got improved responses now. We've got early warning systems, improved flood defences. But is that enough? And it's just really trying to get stakeholders really to start the discussions with stakeholders. And then, like I said, in that workshop, we used that to then come up with a kind of future climate implications, what hazards could be, and we talked through that with the stakeholders. I'll let you either now or down the line, you can have a look at the storylines that we created. But just to summarize, we've used storylines as this kind of narrative-based approach for exploring those cause and effect relationships. It's a really flexible approach. You can bring in physical and social sciences together to kind of have this joint understanding. It really helps break down complexity and kind of helps with cross-discipline working as well. They're so great for just awareness raising and as that communication tool, and the use of narratives. It comes back with what Ilda was saying. People love stories, and if you can center them around people experiences as well, you can bring so much more to the story and to the communication, and yeah, that kind of co-development of that with stakeholders, and it really helps to break down those complexities. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia, for your presentation. I put in the chat the link of this story map, and I find it really, really interesting and interactive and intuitive. And yeah, I mean, stories are much more efficient to bring the message rather than numbers. So it's good to remember. Thank you so much. And again, I remind you that if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A box or curiosity. We will try to address them. And thanks again to Julia. And now I pass the word to Simone.
Hi, good afternoon. Good morning, sorry. Okay. I share my screen. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So today, thanks Fulvio, Gloria for inviting me, and Julia and Hilda for the information and the tips about communication risk. I'm a project manager for the Urban Resilience Department, and today I will show you what we did in the last 3 years through the Reach Out project. So the Reach Out project involves 7 cities around Europe, and Milano is one of them, and some research center and climate services provider. in order to work in to co-develop climate services for climate resilient cities. To support cities in the pathways to climate adaptation. We work around the AAA adaptation framework, which is about analysis, ambition, and action. In 3 years, we realized 3 co-development process: assessing, analysis, ambition, and action. Every city works in a different way, but we combine the information in order to receive feedback and by the end realize a marketplace with all the tools and information. So the project will finish this week, and this is the new website that we realize in which you can find all the information and what we did through the project. So I will go fast in order to have, because I don't have a lot of time to show. So what we did with Milano, we connected the project to the Air and Climate Plan. The Air and Climate Plan is our plan, action plan, which combine adaptation, mitigation, and air climate measure. And in our case, we connected the project to the adaptation pillar of the plan. And we work with the CMCC about pluvia hazard, with the University of Cork about social vulnerability, and Technalia about thermal assessment tool. So we connected to the PAC objective, but we also work in another pillar that is about awareness and engagement. With the support of other 2 project partners, Climate Adaptation Services and NGI from Norway. So what this is just highlight some information we get from the project. As, for example, we have the land surface temperature from Technalia, and then you can see the information from CMCC about green areas, railways, water, and so all the cities infrastructure. And then we have also another map in the right side about social vulnerability from University of Cork. So all this information help us to define our heat risk map at a neighborhood scale that we can that support us to define the priority area for intervention. As for a nature-based solution, but even for a tactical solution as shade and school oasis and other activity that we are in which we are involved. It's in Italian, but you can see some of the activity that we have in like forestazione, the paving, school oasis, and stuff like that. So or we can communicate all of this information to the citizen and decision maker and NGO, and that all of the city affected by the climate change, all of the person affected by the climate change. So we need to bridge the gap, and the climate story help us to in this frame, because the climate story translate the universal language of the science into a more personal and emotional language. And so when we start, every city realize a different climate story, and we start with the story map, as we see before from Julia, but by the end everyone start to shape in a different way. So what is important, the challenge, what is the reason for making a story, the target audience, and the goal, and also the goal, what do you want to achieve with this message. So we use visual to promote the message, and because it's very important, but even in this case, as anticipate Hilda, is important to understand your audience, because if you wanna talk with children, you have language and some picture. For other kind of other part of society, you have other information to highlight. And so translate complex topics into easy message is this is what we did by the end. As you can see, we start from in the left side, you have the information from the future scenario about heat waves from Tecnalia. And then our illustrator, Alessia Iotti, Alterades, translate into another, the same information into another visual. So as you understand, you can understand our audience by the end are the children. And because we think that even if they are a small part of the society, they represent the future of our cities, and it's important to start to engage them, even to receive feedback about what we communicate. This is just a brief introduction. I present now the story, the final version. That is, we start from a story map and finish with the comic strip. And that's nice. And we start with the artificial intelligence, finish with a real illustrator that realize the illustration, the graphic. And this is the story about Gaia and Ambrogio. Gaia is she's 5 years old, and Ambrogio is the grandfather. So I translate in English because our version is in Italian, and so as you can see, we describe a summer day in which Gaia were waiting for the grandfather to go to the park to find some cool shade under the tree, and the temperature is 38 degrees, and the night before was very strong for Ambrogio, 28 degrees in the middle of the night, and he couldn't sleep well and still tired. But when they arrived at the park, they were shocked because something changed also in the landscape, in the park landscape. So here we combine a real picture of the city with illustration, and we start to introduce the vulnerable group about heat waves as a woman and all the people under a tree. So then we describe what happened during the 2022 summer using some real information from local news, and so it was really hot the summer 2022 with tropical nights and problem even especially for Ambrogio and Gaia. What is the illustrator then described Gaia surfing on a heat wave, and so here we have the other information from a tool. This is the historical heat wave plot. And when Ambrogio was young, heat waves were rare events. We have a young Ambrogio in the 1980s with 2 balls, and then we have Gaia today with several balls. And the sites represent, the ball sites represent the heat wave duration, the color, the intensity. But what is interesting about this plot is that in the last 20 years, we start to record heat waves here in the summer and late in the summer. So before were like the heat wave were concentrated in the middle of the summer. Now we start to face it from June until September. And so for that, for Gaia, things will be very different. And Ambrogio tried to cover Gaia that's trying to eat an ice cream, but it's not easy. And then, so this is the plot that I showed you before. Due to climate change, heat waves will become more frequent in the coming years. And you can see here that we have heat waves that start to cover the tree in order to show that the situation will be very difficult in the future. And we have an old Gaia in the 2090s that's still with the heat waves, still facing heat wave. So here we describe a little bit what is why we have the Urbani Thailand effect, and that is not the sun, but more about building roads and concrete. We use a language really for children, yeah, and Here we have planting tree and increasing green space is a way to reduce the urban heat island. And here we combine two maps, the land surface temperature map from Tecnalia and the green area from CMCC. And you can see the direct connection with the coolest space and the green area of the city. So the climate is changing, but we have a powerful ally in this mission, the tree. As the tree grow, they absorb carbon and reduce CO2. Here we have some more information about tree and the climate change. But the tree also help improve the air we breathe, lower temperature, and soften the impact of the heavy rainfall. Summer are getting hotter, but the city has a plan to make things better. It's called Piano Aria e Clima, designed to keep the air cleaner and the days cooler. And many new trees will be planted to create more shade and improve air quality. And in many places, concrete and asphalt will be removed so the soil can breathe again. And this is the end of the story, that Gaia can eat an ice cream with the grandfather in a new green space with flowers, biodiversity, and trees. So what then Gaia tell to the children is be part of the changing. Try to bring your idea and share your experience. And yeah, this is about the project. So we realize the story through we realize the story through a co-development process with the technical partner of the project. And then when we realize the first version in a story maps, we decide to remake the story and starting from the citizens. So we realize in the frame of Reach Out, we realize a workshop with the citizen assembly, permanent citizen assembly of climate change that we have in Milano. There was a group working on climate risk communication and in climate risk communication, and we realized a workshop in order to receive feedback and also to explain how we work to communicate the heat risk. And then when we collect all the information from the citizen, these 20 people, so we collect all the information, and then we start to find the illustrator that can translate really. And then we start to, when we define the audience, so the children, we start to find the illustrator, and in our case was very easy because in Italy Alessia Iotti is really popular. She is a climate activist and illustrator, and she work also in a national TV. And so we said, okay, let's engage Alessia because she can really represent what we need, what we wanna communicate. And what this is very interesting because if I talk about with my colleagues about the climate story, they say, we need to put more information. When you talk with the illustrator, she said, you need less information because children don't understand all of this information. So in the last period, we cut information, not add start to cut information in order to achieve our results. So engage the children, and I hope that we will do this. So just that. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone, for your presentation. And yeah, I also really appreciate the example of the climate story. And I think also it's important to remember to also ask external consultants and experts and that are doing this, like and thinking about artists, as in your case, or graphic designers, because of course we cannot do everything, and like having a visual, nice and appealing communication strategy that is targeted for children or even for adults, it's really important. So thank you. I put in the chat like the link for the Instagram account of Alessia Iotti.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
But there are many examples also, like in the international community of, and many more European projects are actually involving artists to communicate their impacts and results to a wider audience. And I leave the floor to Fulvio.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gloria, and thank everyone of our speaker. I think these presentations are nicely connected to each other because we heard some insights and tips for science communication and how important it is to frame the message and use narrative stories, things that are more user-friendly, familiar, and can be digestible, understandable to everyone involved in this climate risk, being decision makers, but also the broader public. I would say that there is somehow a red line connecting all this presentation, and that is about making complex climate risk data and information into more digestible formats and trying to reach different audiences. So I would direct a first question. I can see that there is already a question in the chat that is more general, and maybe we can approach this after this question. So what about adjusting the communication for different groups? We heard about tips and different approaches more devoted to decision making and supporting decision making, so making complex, unpacking the complexity of multi-risk events for supporting decision-making process, and also other approaches more in line with raising the awareness of the public and also creating some kind of legitimacy or public support for certain actions. So how to adjust the communication for different groups, how to address the communication activities so that everyone take away the key messages. I'm directing the question to all of you. I can see also there are some raised hands, but if any of you want to start, that could be great, wonderful.
I'm happy to start. I think that's a really interesting. I think it's a really interesting question because your audience is so important, and I think Simone and Ilda both talked about this in their presentations. You know, knowing your audience and things, and in our process of developing a storyline, the first stage is really understanding why you're doing a storyline, who's it for, who your users are, and I think depending on the communication you're doing, sometimes there isn't a one size fits all. It's maybe not appropriate to have one output that can be used by different groups. The storylines that we're doing, they're very much targeted at decision makers, you know, at sort of stakeholders from different sectoral groups for them to action on. But saying that, I think the use of just having some videos, having cartoons, you know, the example that Simona showed, it's for children, but I got a lot out of that as an adult and a researcher. You know, I think there can be, you know, I think by simplifying the message, the way that's been done, it's still really accessible for lots of different groups. People can take different things away from it. So I think just having really open and really lovely visuals, I think just really helps with that.
If I may add on what Julia said, actually the tips, the strategies that is usually used when you have a different public from experts is to think about a 9-year-old audience and make something that is understandable for that, because it means that any non-experts will understand it. And so what Julia said, it makes perfectly sense. So start from something that is really also catchy in a way, like the comics that Simone used. And because it's good for everybody. So being good for children, it means that it's good really for everybody. And one more thing, you can be also more sophisticated. So for instance, there are studies about audience segmentation, with the idea that even if we make big categories like children, then inside this category, there will be different aspects. So think about, for instance, immigrants or these children with disabilities. So they are not all the same in terms of an audience for communication. But again, the 9-year rule, I think, is a very good one to use. And as Simone did also, to have an interaction with your audience, to be sure that it's understandable, to build it with that. So I really enjoyed both the projects by Giulia and Simone, because they are really an application of the principles that I shared.
Thank you so much. I have another question, and then we will pass the floor to the questions in the audience. So, my question is regarding like how to translate complexity. Like Simone mentioned before in the Milan climate story, like it was addressed to children, so they have to remove certain things. But how do it's hard to find the balance between accuracy and accessibility. Like you don't want to oversimplify aspects, like for example in the Myriad project, like multi-risk, it's complex intrinsically. So do you have any concerns, tips, or guiding principles on how to strike and find this balance and manage to translate complexity into an accessible way? Anyone that has any thoughts is welcome.
I think that's a really important point, because just because you simplifying the message doesn't mean you have to lose the accuracy. You can't lose the accuracy. You know, what you're trying to do is translate something that's very complex into something that's actionable. And if you lose your accuracy, it's not actionable. And so I think I'm not really sure about any kind of guidelines on how we've done that. I think it is difficult. It is difficult, and it is a fine balance. But I think just trying to imagine explaining it to someone who is non-technical and using all these different kind of visual elements and things can really help with that, and really, you know, talking to people as well, you know, talking to non-experts and a whole range of different people to really understand, you know, to make sure that they're understanding what you're saying and can, I don't know, almost tell it back to you, you know, so that you can understand that they've got the message. And, you know, with volcanoes, this is obviously slightly separate from the Myriad project, but with volcanoes, everyone thinks that they know volcanoes, and you see communications around volcanoes all the time that are slightly incorrect, because people don't know how to talk about magma and lava, and they don't know how to talk about these processes without just really, you know, dumbing it down to the point of inaccuracy. And that's quite difficult, because you want to, you need to convey that. I don't think I've provided any strategies there. I'm sorry, I'm not sure. but yeah, it's a really important point that we don't lose the accuracy.
Yeah. Again, if I follow Giulia, I think that this is a concern for scientists for sure, because the feeling is that if we don't say everything about what we studied, it doesn't make sense. And this has a lot to do with our approach with other scientists. So this is what you do usually in a scientific conference or in a scientific paper. And as strategy, what I would suggest is really the interaction and collaboration with expert communicators, like the designers or the visual experts that were using the two projects, because in that case the scientists can really ensure the accuracy. So what is said, even if simplified, is accurate. But then there is also someone that is more expert on what people can get. And I really like what Simone said, that they needed to leave out a lot of things to make it understandable. But still, I'm sure it was accurate with what they share in terms of data and so on.
I think Simone inspired with the design of the climate stories, but do you want to respond to that, react, or add something? Feel free to jump in.
No, just that when we start was like we were working in a project co-developing climate services, and the climate story for the city apps were something like a game, something to do because we have to do. But when we start to work, get engaged by this communication tool, we start to understand really the potential of this tool. And this was very nice because if you go to see all the climate story of the reach out cities, by the end, every story is completely different. But even we start with the story maps, but by the end, we say, okay, we want to communicate with the children. We need something like a YouTube video with the voiceover and information. Of course, for other not, but for the children, by the end, we will prepare a video clip, 3 minutes, not more, because you can engage for 3 minutes children talking about climate change. If you start to talk about climate change and everything is nice for you because you say, oh, look how many things I do in this frame, no? But what is the message that you are sending? That is the key, I think. As I hope that when we realize the story, we follow the Hilda's tips before, because we try really our approach were with methods, not let's telling a story. Everyone has a storyline, and we follow that information. So just that.
Thank you very much, Simone. Maybe I can direct another question from the audience to, I suppose, is intended for you. And then we have another question that was already answered by Julia, but maybe there are some other thoughts that could be shared. So, Simone, and everyone, how to encourage climate action that goes beyond encouraging individual climate action. For example, planting trees and waste segregation are commonly acceptable individual actions, but it takes the focus of accountability away from what's causing climate change. So the anonymous attendee will be able to know your thoughts. And even though I think planting trees is not so legitimate and acceptable as one may think.
Yeah, that is true. But for example, I start the telling about the project that we connect the project to the Air and Climate Plan. So by the end, we promote the project tool because we demonstrate that we can use that information even for engage citizen, not only for have information about climate for policymaker. And then we try to highlight the air and climate plan action about nature-based solution and adaptation. So what you say is true, but we are telling what we are doing in this way. So if there are people that are happy, people not happy, but we are trying through the story even to explain why we need more tree, we need the paving and other things. We have also other action, but we didn't put other action. We put the action connected to the tree and natural-based solution. So, and it's something that the city is doing. And when the Milanese people goes around and see the paving program, the paving action around the cities, they can understand why we are liberate the soil, no? Something like that. No one say it's through this, but imagine when you go to show the story, just one minute. When you go to organize a workshop with the citizen, you are with your face in front of the citizen, and they are not people that support you. That are people not voluntary, is something, a statistical part of the society. So you have in the same board, you have people that believe in the green and people that believe in gasoline. So is that, and you have to match also this. For that, put out some information that can be not so easy to.
Thank you, Simone. I was losing for a bit the information, but maybe Hilda, do you want to
Yeah,
add
I was
something?
just, yes, now as scientist, if I will interpret the question, it's more an issue of putting in place actions for adaptation or mitigation. And for those that study climate change, it's clear that we need both. So we need adaptation, we need mitigation. Also because even if we stop our emissions today, we'll have to manage for at least another 100 years the emissions that we emit yesterday. So it means that in any case, we will need some adaptation. But as Simone said, this project was specifically on that, but there are also other projects of mitigation. And I agree that we need both of them. And we need to make clear that also that adaptation has some limits. So beyond a certain limit, we cannot adapt anymore. So mitigation is still needed.
Thank you very much, Hilda, for your addition. I think it pretty much summarized that we are here segmenting pieces of knowledge and action from, for example, the municipality of Milan to tell a story, which is about how to communicate risks, climate risks. We have another also question from the audience that Julia nicely replied, but have you measured the results impact of the communication to see if communication approach work? What would be your approach to that in terms of approach indicators and so on? So it's about measuring the impact of your communication. Julia, you already replied something. It's not about measuring, but feedback from stakeholders. So they are using the storylines.
Yeah, it would be great to measure that and have some sort of indicator so that we could to actually measure what the impact is. I think at the moment that's not something we can do. We've used storylines. We're still sort of rolling them out. We're still kind of seeing that uptake of them by the different stakeholder groups. Some of the stakeholder groups have talked about wanting to use storylines within their organizations to really engage their teams. But yeah, that's not really measurable just now. So I'm not sure actually at the moment how we would measure that, but we know that there is impact, but it's that measurable impact which is difficult.
Thank you, Julia. Hilda, do you want to add something?
Yes, in terms of what is going on in science communication, there are a lot of studies on evaluation of the impact that is quite, as Julia mentioned, is not so easy. But the real challenge is going beyond the numbers, because the traditional way, also as requested by the European project, is to have these KPIs, so the key performance indicators, so how many people attended your event and so on. But that's not really the impact, that's the direct outcome. So actually what Julia was mentioning, so the feedback from stakeholders can be used as a qualitative indicator that something is happening. And yes, the research is going to the direction to try to frame and to standardize also these kind of indicators. But for sure, it's a very relevant and needed aspect, evaluating the impact. Not the easiest one.
Thank you very much, Hilda, for this addition. Simone, do you have further thoughts about this? You already released the climate stories and the risk maps. You design a more appealing one. So if you have further thought, we are here to hear yours.
No, we start. No, what I would like to say that is interesting what we say about adaptation, mitigation before. If I can add this something, but what could be nice is continuing to realize this kind of story. Today we talk about it, but tomorrow Gaia can talk about pluvial flood or about carbon neutrality. And we have also, from another department of the city, we have a story about, the name is Mission Clean Air, with the same illustrator, with the story of other two children. So if we wanna really invest in this kind of activity that I think is very interesting and important, we cannot, not, what I can say is not to put everything in one story, but realize several stories as several comic strips. Today, Gaia with the grandpa about heat waves. Tomorrow, maybe with uncle with another activity, or maybe some friends of Gaia tell her about when we talk also about before migrants and disability. So we can also start to introduce through the climate story to the story of Gaia other topics, but for me is important is don't put everything together, just to message, audience, message, audience, message. So this is my recommendation.
Thank you so much, Simone. And we are running out of time. We have 2 questions in the people who will like to speak. We can try to address both. I would ask to Darren. Now you can speak. You can speak. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. And if not, we have Tamer Atalay. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. You can also unmute yourself and ask your question. You should be able to. Or maybe we have some technical problems. Well, if you have any other questions, please write them in the chat or write to us through the CLIMAAX Community of Practice web email account. Then before closing, I just had a final questions about the lessons learned from the from these communication activities that you have performed. Simone already mentioned these not trying to do everything, but if you have something that struck with you in these projects, during this activity that you didn't thought about before and you would like to share, we're happy to know your thoughts.
I can say something maybe. I think for me the biggest kind of lesson and challenge has just been around that complexity of dealing with multi-risk. And at the start of the project, we brought together a lot of different people from different disciplines, researchers, practitioners, stakeholders, stakeholders and people who represent different sectors, all coming from different aspects with different terminology, different use of terminology. People in the finance sector, they talk about perils and they talk about hazards in different ways. And I think that was a real eye-opener, was just how do we bring all these people together with different backgrounds, with different ideas of things, to actually talk about something that's really complex in itself as well. And so for us, it's been a challenge building that that knowledge base across everyone and building that understanding across everyone to then start, you know, implementing any approaches and things. So I think really just having really early conversations about what, you know, simple things, you know, what is your understanding of what a multi-hazard event is? What's your understanding of, you know, multi-risk? What's your understanding of, you know, all these different things? And then you can start building up from there. And that's been a really important part of what we've done. So, you know, we're right at the end of the project now. And I mean, even around storylines, you know, the definition of what a storyline is it a story map output, or is it a process of coming up and going through, collecting the data, collecting the narratives and things? And it's really difficult bringing all that together and getting to a point where you can go off and use that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Julia. There is other question in the chat. Unfortunately, there is very limited time, so just maybe we can try to catch up with this question later on and ask our speakers also to support us. And as you know, you can always reach out to the CLIMAAX community of practice using the email. Hopefully, Gloria, if you could put this in the chat. Meanwhile, I'm going to share my screen because we are running out of time and we would like to conclude by providing you some more information. First of all, I thanks again all our speakers. Amazing hearing tips, experiences in risk communication, and we hope the community of practitioners is enjoying this webinar and is finding it useful. As we wrap up today's session, before we close, we remind you that we have a fixed schedule for the CLIMAAX Community of Practice events, with session that usually will take place every fourth Thursday of the month at the usual time, 10:30, except before Easter, where we will have the next webinar on April 16th, same time, and will be about navigating the uncertainty in future scenarios. And in this event, we'll try to explore how scenarios are generated, what are the bias and uncertainty involved and what they mean, and how to choose the most suitable models, share socioeconomic pathways, and representative concentration pathways. And to support this process, our team that is developing the CLIMAAX toolbox is currently developing a workflow that should help practitioners engage in climate risk assessment to visualize climate scenarios, assess regional biases and uncertainties to identify the most relevant option for the need. So this session basically will provide an opportunity to contribute to the co-design of this tool in order that this reflects your priorities and capabilities. So you can provide feedback on preferred visualization formats, key variables for the assessments, and so on. So basically, it's a session to present a somehow better version of this tool, and your insights will be used and relevant to directly shape this tool. So don't miss out. And the upcoming event is also fundraising for climate risk assessment on May 22nd. Anyway, I can't see the chats, but I suppose that my colleagues are putting the registration link for the April 16 event. And before closing, just a quick final message on how to engage or stay engaged with the CoP. We encourage you to join us for this session and continue the conversation, but also to reach out to our speakers. You have all the links and you can also connect with further community of practices and further examples from adaptation project. So you can join the CoP by our CoP by joining the LinkedIn group. We will put the link in the chat. You are more than welcome also to participate to our surveys on climate risk assessment practices, but also on investments in climate services. These outcomes from the survey will be used to refine the outcomes of CLIMAAX and so on. Finally, you can directly subscribe to our community of practice via the CLIMAAX website. Under participate, you can find the community of practice, and you have a register button to include your email to receive further communication and updates. So we will share the link in the chat to these resources or surveys, link the group and the CLIMAAX community of practice website. And let's say that with this being said, we can close this session. Thank you once again for joining us today, and we look forward to see you again next time. And thanks again to our speakers. Bye now.